So again, good afternoon to everybody who's here. It's possible that some more may join us during the session. And welcome to this webinar, which was to have taken place first in November, then in December, but for various reasons got delayed. I'm really happy uh, to have my fellow panelists with me today. And the thing that's common to all of us, apart from the fact that we all work and are based at the Valley School in Bangalore, is that we are all old students of Krishnamurti schools who have returned to teach, though we are not all old students of Valley School itself. And we thought that that would make for an interesting starting point. And the subject of our webinar is discovering the school, a subject that emerged in the course of a conversation that we were having amongst us. It may seem somewhat intriguing, but actually isn't, because I think another thing that's common to all of our experiences is that having come back to these schools to teach, we find ourselves in some way literally discovering or rediscovering the schools, uh, often in ways that we really hadn't fathomed when we were students in the school. So this is our underlying subject, though we'll begin with a few other things just so that all the panelists have a chance to introduce themselves and speak a little bit about their journeys from being students to coming back as teachers in the schools. And before we start, I'll just mention that at any point, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, either any one of us in particular or the panel as a whole, you'll see a Q&A box. Do feel free to type in your questions there. And as a panel, we'll be speaking initially amongst ourselves for at least 45 minutes, possibly a little longer. And then we'll take as many of the questions as we can. So do please keep the questions coming as and when they occur to you. So we have on the panel Indus, Prashanth, and Kaavya. And I'd like first to ask each of you to just say a little bit about yourselves, which schools you were in, when you finished, and maybe a little bit about how you decided to come back and work in Valley School. So who wants to go first? Okay, we'll go alphabetically in this.
Okay. So I studied at the Valley School from class 3 to class 12. And I teach English in high school now at Valley. And when I was thinking about this question about what made me decide to come back, I think what first came to mind is the fact that I think the Valley is a place where I can be most myself. And when I was wondering why that might be the case, I think it's because even as a child here, I was treated with with a great deal of affection and respect. And a spirit of inquiry was encouraged in me, so that I actually grew, from being a very shy child in the third grade to being a fairly fearless, even outspoken 12th grader, and who asked a lot of questions in culture class, and questions that were, I think, fortunately and rightly interpreted by Dr. Satish Namdar, who was our principal then, as a form of love. And he had said to me, I think, once at the end of a culture class, probably when I was in grade 12, probably one that I had asked a lot of questions at, that if you love the place so much, you should come back here to teach. So I think even before I left, that invitation was in my heart. And but having said that, I did, in fact, when I was at college, I took a course on philosophy of education, and I realized, I think then, that maybe one of the only meaningful ways to bring about a radical and lasting change in society is to think about to carefully think about how we are, how young people are being educated. And it made me feel very grateful for the fact that my father had been so moved by a book of Krishnamurti's, Freedom from the Known, which I think he read when he was about the age that I am now, that made my parents make a series of sort of counterintuitive, courageous choices that allowed me to go to Valley School. And anyway, that course at college piqued my curiosity in education, and I was keen to explore it. And I, in fact, even applied to be a part of the first cohort of Teach for India fellows, and was keen to accept that. But I had a professor, the same professor actually, who taught this course on the philosophy of education, who talked me out of it. Her husband was a veteran high school English teacher, and she firmly believed that teaching was not something you did as service, like fresh out of college and just for 2 years before you went on to graduate school. She said teaching is more of a vocation. It's meaningful work of the most intellectually stimulating, creatively satisfying, emotionally rewarding sort. And you should think it through carefully and choose it with conviction and a wholehearted commitment. So I instead went to graduate school then. And at graduate school, I found myself quite serendipitously living on the street that John Dewey had once lived on, who was a philosopher. When I encountered him in that course, whom I felt had great resonances with Krishnamurti, because I remember he said something like, just society begins in a classroom where questions are welcomed. And I remember thinking, oh, this is the same way that I was raised. And and at the time, I remember being also quite enchanted by the contemporary philosopher queen of the Teachers College at Columbia, Maxine Greene, who again, we had a great emphasis on art at the Valley growing up with the Art Village, and it's what makes it so distinctive. And she also believed in aesthetic education and social imagination and wide awakeness, and this idea that part of teaching is helping people to create themselves. So I remained really curious about education all through, college and graduate school. And in graduate school, I sought out a part practicum, part pedagogy course that allowed me to teach a ninth grade class at a high school in the neighborhood. And it was the first, and also to reflect on the teaching learning process. And it was the first time that I discovered that unparalleled joy of being a bridge between a child and a text. And I decided that this is what I really wanted to do. And I wanted to accept that invitation to come back to do it at Valley because, as I said, it's a place where I could be most myself and to do this there. So, yeah, that's about me.
How interesting. I was especially struck by, the advice you mentioned earlier that it's important to think of teaching as a vocation rather than as service. And it's an intellectually stimulating vocation as well, because we sometimes fall into this way of thinking of teaching as being more in the area of service, if not social service. And people think you're being very noble when you make a decision to become a teacher. It's as if you're giving up something. But anyway, we'll perhaps come back to that. Kaavya, what about you?
So I actually studied in the Valley School from the first standard up until 12th. So that was from 1990 to 2002, and it was a kind of a safe space for me initially because there was a lot of trouble initially. When I was very young, at home. So it became this place which was really a grounding space for me, and there was a lot of genuine warmth and love that I got from everybody in school. And then of course I grew up and I finished my 12th standard as well at the Valley, and then I went on to do other things, particularly in environment related work. um, and the reason sort of to come back was really when we decided that we wanted our daughter to also study at the Valley School and to really enjoy her childhood and get to know herself. And somehow this was one of the only places that sort of came to mind for her to be able to do that. And then that was when Jairam uncle just in passing said that, oh, you have to come back and teach. And like Indus said, Namdar uncle always, every 12th standard class that passed out, he would say that you guys must come back and teach. And my mom would also keep telling me that, you have to go and give back to school. And there was never a sort of opportunity where I felt that I was ready to do that. So somehow things came together, maybe 4 or 5 years back when that happened. So it was not really a conscious decision to become a teacher. It
Right.
just happened. Yeah.
So I think looks as if Valley School seniors have been extremely persuasive in in getting and managed to get students back to teach. That's a nice thing. But also you mentioned one other factor for you was having a Krishnamurti school or Valley School, especially for your daughter to grow up in. In fact, this is again something which I hope we can come back to because, of course, all three of you are parents, and two of you are parents of children who are currently in the school. And so that's a third role with which you're engaging with the school, as a student, as a teacher, as a parent as well. And maybe we can look at that in the course of our conversation today. Yeah, so thank you. And how about you, Prashant?
Yeah, hi. So, I grew up in Rishi Valley. My parents had been working there even before I was born, and so these schools, and in this case, Rishi Valley was not just a school but also home, and continues to be home, of which I'm very thrilled about. uh, I to me, so yeah, I grew up there. I did all my schooling there up until class 12, after which I did my graduation in Chennai, um, and then worked in the corporate sector for a few years, and then eventually came to Valley School. I joined Valley in 2019, after having graduated Rishi Valley in 2008. So it was about 11 years away. Um, for me, the decision to come back was something I could relate to what Indus and Kavya was saying. I think it was ingrained, right? Maybe I can't quite recall a specific incident that kind of stayed with me and proved to be a kind of anchor to come back to. But I mean, I like to share this anecdote with people, right? Because I mean, in hindsight, it's quite amusing, although it wasn't at the time. So this was after my graduation, and there was recruitment on campus from these corporates, and so there's this corporate that came, and I had got through the first few rounds, and it was the final round, and they were asking me, so what is your plan if you do get through? And I remember sharing with them that, that I think word for word, I said something like, you seem to be paying quite well. So I think I'll work here for a couple of years before I probably head back to teaching in one of these schools. So no prizes for guessing how the interview went and what the results were. But but that said, I managed to not make the same mistake in a few other interviews, and I did work in the corporate sector for about 7 years or so. Um, I think for me, it was really less about moving away from the corporate space as much as actually being drawn to these places. And not just teaching in these spaces, but also being able to, the idea of living in these spaces was something that was greatly appealing. Having grown up there and having also going back, the fact that I'd go back quite regularly to Rishi Valley to meet my parents, um, and there was this one time I remarked to my wife, that, hey, Amapa get to walk past these hills and trees while they go to work, and we've got to deal with junctions and signals. And so the space itself was also something that proved to be of great appeal to me. Additionally, I would say as much relevance and importance was that I had a few friends and made a few friends after school, after I graduated school, but these were young teachers who had worked there themselves for a few years, and they would always speak with such passion and joy and laughter about their experiences teaching there, with students, with colleagues, and there seemed to be real life in there, if I could use that word, in their sharing, um, and that's something, as I got closer to them, it's something I found out, learned more about, and it only kind of, I suppose, reinforced that conviction, that I would one day come back. And additionally, I would say another big motivating factor for me was to study the subjects I didn't choose to study after class 10, right? I mean, when you're in class 10 at age 14, 15, whatever, um, you are making a decision, or a decision that kind of determines what you do and where you work, at least for the next 7, 8 years, I would say. Certainly, so for in my case. And so, for various reasons, the priorities you have in class 10 are quite different from what I had, well, developed in adulthood. So I went down the commerce route, and I can't say that that was what I really wanted to study. And my interest, I soon discovered, was really in language and the humanities. And so the idea of learning these subjects or relearning these subjects through teaching was a big pull for me as well. Uh, yeah, and lastly, of course, I there were parts of school that I wanted to relive as is, right? The opportunity to play, engage in sport regularly, have deep, meaningful relationships with the people there, which was something I was lucky enough to have in school. Um, and but also engage with certain things in a slightly different spirit, and this goes back to what I was saying about engaging with subjects that I didn't quite study, and here was an opportunity to learn for the sake of learning, without the pressure of marks, without the pressure of performance. And so that has a different quality. So these were some of the reasons that really um, led me to eventually come back. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Prashant. It was so interesting to listen to all three of you because, uh, circumstantially, there are differences in the in the way these decisions were taken for each of you. And yet, one strong underlying commonality, it seems to me, has to do with the experience, obviously, you had as students in these places. Uh, and I think all of you in different ways have mentioned relationships with people, with adults, with peers. And we've also heard about, just the location of these places, beautifully located, plenty of nature, as opposed to the realities of city life, commuting, and so on. So if I just take these two, relationships and nature, why, because since all of you have spoken about them either directly or implicitly, why do you think that they are so important to the lives of these schools? What's the connection? Do you see a connection between these and, let's say, the underlying philosophy of the school? Do you, or is it just something that's just happened almost by chance? Does the question feel concrete enough to address? I mean, I'd just love to know your thoughts on this. What's the role that these play in the lives of these schools? Anybody, we don't have to go alphabetically.
I'm struck by what you said, Sid, about this idea of, does it just happen organically? I think in this case, both relationship and nature that you mentioned, I think both have a substantial role to play, but through the subconscious in some ways, without actually being aware of it on every single passing day. Because you do, I mean, having lived in these spaces, you don't like, for example, when I step out into the city and then people visit, they always tell me, "Hey, you're so lucky to be in a space like this," and I could somewhere relate to that idea, but it was still home, so it's difficult to be awestruck, let's say, by the place you live in and kind of breathe and have only it's the only space I really knew intimately. But I think there's a role that these things have to play in shaping your priorities, the rhythm of your life, even if I could use that slightly abstract term. Um, but it becomes your memories, for example, are always in these spaces, right? And so it just becomes something that comfortably sits inside you without you really ever acknowledging it, maybe. And I would say similarly, I feel similarly about relationships, right? I mean, I, that struck me quite hard when I stepped out, like you said, stepped out of the school where I was thrown. It felt like I was thrown into a city, right? And yeah, having grown up in a campus where everyone knew me and there was warmth all around, and I was like one of my friends says, he says you were perhaps almost like the son of the valley, and I could really relate to that. I was like, absolutely, I was lucky enough to feel that way. And then when you go out into the city, you're another person, and you have to adapt to that, and then you see what's missing. And I remember actually having to I found the first few months quite difficult, not just owing to homesickness in the sense of missing staying at home and missing parents and so on, but also being almost um, um, yeah, embraced in that space, both through nature and by the adults there. Yeah, so
Right.
I think it's forms a very, I don't know if I've responded adequately to your question, but I do think it plays a very strong role without one's actually knowing it. Yeah.
Right. That's so interesting. You said it seems to happen sort of subconsciously. That's the word you used earlier. They're not
Mhm.
always thinking about it explicitly.
Yeah.
Would that be true for both of you also, Indus, Kavya? I mean, what was your experience of these things?
I think so. Like I would agree with Prashant. Like, but I also think that it's very much by intent. It's intentionally creating this structure which helps you to sort of feel relationships in a different way, or to look at nature in a different way. And then when you finish and when you leave, it starts coming back to you, but very slowly. But when you look at the experiences that you then have, then you're comparing it with what you had, and then you realize that that was kind of different. It was not, it's not like how everyone else is. And but then you also want that a lot more. You want that idea. That's so much more nicer and ideal. um so even simple things like standing up in class when the teacher walks in college is something that we I couldn't wrap my head around. Why do I have to stand up and say good morning, sir? Eventually you get over it, but it's still very odd. Or somebody says, call me Dr. So and so. And you're never told to do that all your life. So that starts making you think about, why is it that I have to conform to these things? Yeah.
It's so, I was just struck by your example of standing up in class because, when I first went after some years at Rishi Valley and then at a school in Uttarkashi to Rajghat, and I was there just quite rather briefly. In those days, it was the established practice that children got up, stood up when teachers entered the classroom in Rajghat, which is a Krishnamurti school. and where, in fact, relationships, as you've been describing, were in fact very affectionate. It's not that Rajghat was a hugely formal place. So I think there's also something culture specific about some of these ways in which, relationship manifests. And more recently, when I was working in Rajghat again, I found that at some point that practice had been jettisoned. I mean, there was nobody getting up for anyone. Uh, I was struck by what you said, that while, as Prashanth said, there's a kind of subconscious element to the way one experiences these things, it comes out of a certain intentionality. It seems to be built into the way these schools are, and that emerges, I think, from a philosophy. Yeah, Indus, something you'd like to, yeah.
Yes, I think absolutely both those two things, that it's intentional and that it feels subconscious. I think my experience as a student was that it felt subconscious. It felt like it was, whether it's the natural world and how we interact with it or relationships, it felt like, oh, yes, this is how it is meant to be. But when you return to teach, I think is when you realize also how intentional it is, how carefully it is, how carefully courageous choices are being made to make it different from many things that are happening otherwise, right? In both those realms, whether it's with the natural world or with relationship. So that strikes me that for me it switched. I could see how intentional it was later when I joined to teach, and also that in terms of both those two things are partly why again I was so keen for my daughter to grow up here. These two things, the natural world, growing up in this enchanted forest, and growing up to be treated the way that I was treated as a little girl. So yeah. Both those things.
So at this point, I mean, I see that, time just seems to be going so quickly. We've already spent almost half an hour, and there's so much more I'd like to ask you. I'd like to ask a question, which is, given that, nature, relationships, certain kinds of experiences we had as students in these schools were instrumental in bringing us back to teach. Obviously, I mean, that one wouldn't go back to teach if one hadn't in some way been, moved by one's experience as a student. My question now is about what were the discordances, if any? You come back with certain expectations, with certain, uh, dear memories and all of that. Or let me not even say discordances, because that might suggest something like conflict. One can get into that as well. But before that, what were the things that were, let's say, unexpected? You went back as a teacher, and of course, as a teacher, your role is different. And what were some of the things you hadn't really expected when you went back? If you'd like to share anything about that, any of you.
I think, when I was thinking about returning like this and what I didn't quite expect, I think I realized that, when I returned, that sometimes ex-students um, can be perceived as being a little bit entitled, and I wanted to avoid falling in that trap myself. And then a couple of years on, especially when my daughter was joining school, I realized that also ex-students can sometimes become quite notorious for becoming difficult parents when they return, when their own children come back to school. Maybe partly because they actually, carry with them these memories of their golden years spent at school, and then they sort of think of it as a template for how their children's lives will play out. And again, I wanted to avoid that trap as well. But the more time that I've spent at school, and this is my 12th year now teaching at Valley, I think I realized that. That actually ex-students in the school are inextricably interlinked. We are, and so it's wise for us to be good to each other, right? For the school and ex-students to sort of have that And maybe though, it is a fact that ex-students will end up asking more questions, in part perhaps because they were raised to do this. But hopefully, we can all see questions as a form of love. We can see questions and we can sort of approach each other in that spirit, both ex-students and the school, that, we can engage, we can ask questions, but we can see them as a form of being inextricably interlinked, as a form of love. That has been something that I think has taken me a while to figure out how to make sense of. And but sort of actually more, in a way, more strikingly, I think when I returned to teach at school, I realized both how beautiful and how fragile the school really is. And what I mean by that is, I think that beautiful in the sense that in a way it feels like it's a blank canvas, and that you have sort of all these possibilities, full of possibilities, how we can hold space for children to bloom and grow. It feels beautiful. At the same time, though, it also feels fragile because, as a friend of mine said quite wisely, the intent is only as alive as it is in each of our hearts. So we have this sense that, with this great freedom comes great responsibility for us as the adults in that space. Because as someone else, was another friend of mine said to me once, she said, how do you orient your teachers toward the school's philosophy? And I was telling her all the things that we do. And then she said, yeah, but I guess you're up against 30 years of conditioning at least. So I think each of us has to be engaged in that sort of reflective practice to really, in a way, allow that blank canvas to become a beautiful thing for the children who are now, with us in this space. And on a slightly different note, I think that also, the when you look at the world around us, it feels like the school's core values are very much at odds with some of the prevalent values of the age, right? So whether it's consumerism or materialism or more, polarization or divisiveness or hatred, and to resist them takes a lot of courage. And if anything, the pressure feels more intense now than it did feel like it was when we were growing up. So perhaps sort of now more than ever, we need to sort of be these resilient spaces where we can raise a different kind of human being. But these are all the different things that I think came to my mind about what was unexpected in a way when I came back to teach.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to respond to that? In fact, I hope both of you will. I'll come back to some of the things Indus said, but I'd just like to hear others as well.
No, I mean, I grew up in Rishi Valley, and of course, I then joined uh, Valley School as a teacher. And I suppose when I had imagined this move, because that's something I'd done a lot of quite naturally, given that I always wanted to come back. Uh, the only point or frame of reference that I had was my relationship with my teachers when I was a student. And of course, there had been sufficient time that had passed. And of course, then joining another school, set in a different place, and so on, with a different culture as these schools kind of have organically developed into. So I suppose I was struck by, to a degree, the informality I had encountered in Valley, which was not something I had quite expected. And so it took me a while to reorient myself, because there was all of this expectation which has purely come from my past, and there was the reality of the now, the here and now, which was different. But when I say informality, I mean candor, I mean questioning all the things Indus was mentioning, which wasn't something perhaps I as a student didn't quite embody, right? So it's took a little bit of adjusting there, but it it was. I remember having a conversation with my mentor at the time as well in that first year, and I thought it was very interesting to kind of adjust to this and respond with a kind of. It almost forced me to park my conditioning aside. That's the word Indus used, and say, hey, okay, let's. So far, it's all been about, okay, I'm going to relive some of these experiences. But that, I suppose, in some way sharpened my focus to, okay, what is in front of me right now? How do I respond to this? So that was something that was interesting. But as for the role of my past experiences, it was very interesting. That first year again, I the first year in Valley, I stayed on campus, after which I moved out. So when I stayed on campus, of course, I was working with the middle school children at the time in my first year. And but that was only during school hours. Post school hours, I was interacting with the 11th and 12th who stay on campus, right? So I'd play sport, primarily that with them, but also prep and dinner and walks and so on. And I I quite regularly had dreams about me as a student, but they would be very contorted dreams, right? So I would be a student with
Right.
some of my older teachers, but then there would also be my classmates would be the students I'm teaching. So it was all of this mixing up that kind of happened, which only further kind of confirmed the obvious to me that this is a kind of it's a new experience, but not a wholly new experience. Uh, so yeah, I would have dreams about going on walks and hikes as a student, and somehow they seem to be happening in Valley and all of those things. But more pertinently, and where I thought I had to kind of watch myself a little, was that it can become you can fall into the trap of, oh, you know what? I have experienced this too, right? And respond from that place as a teacher. And I think that can be a little, let's say, counterproductive sometimes, right? When let's say, as regularly it happens in middle school, um, where there's conflict between two children and someone's been a little unkind to another, one can quite easily fall into the trap of, oh, yes, I have also perhaps been on the receiving end of this unkindness when I was a student. And then you could fall into the trap of responding almost emotionally, right? And instead of actually finding out more about what happened, right? So it's something I had to consciously kind of almost unknot myself from, so that I could once again meet the moment, so to speak. Um, yeah, and equally also enjoy not just unpleasant experiences or dealing with difficult situations in class, but even in my own course of living the life in Valley. For example, in school, I remember when I was a student, I would identify as being good at a certain sport, let's say, and there was always that pressure to do well in that sport. And here I am as a teacher, I don't have to carry that pressure anymore. I am an adult. I'm able to see see the trappings, let's say, of that form of thinking, and so to perhaps just enjoy playing or enjoy doing something with attention, with a degree of depth, and so on. So I would say this is how I kind of see the past relating my experiences as a student relating to my experience as a teacher.
Thanks, Prashant. That was very vivid, some of the instances you gave, and I hope you've overcome this phase of distorted dreams about being teacher and student. What about you, Kavya?
I think you know, I was just thinking about this. So coming back, I came back after a very long time. So it was 20 plus years. So I don't think I had too many of these romantic ideas of what it should be. Um, but then I was very nervous, of course, because in the beginning I was given to teach. I don't know anything about geog. I never knew anything about geography at the time. So it was really hard to put myself in front of these 30 kids, and they're just fresh out of COVID. So there was that, but then I sort of felt like they're a lot like how we were, in the sense there's something in them that is there because they are part of this space. So the way that they ask questions, or the way they don't want, they're not too scared of you, all of those things was what I felt. There is a lot of continuity in something about the essence of everybody there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There certainly is that. And it's, I think, connected to what Prashanth was saying also, which is sort of discovering the child, the children in the space in which they are without a lot of one's own sort of preconceptions and rooting, without rooting one's observations invariably in one's own experience and background or conditioning, as Indus called it. I'd like to ask now, I'd like to actually bring up this word which is central to our topic, which is discovering the school. Uh, I wonder if each of you could say something which struck you with great force as being new to how you understood the school as a student once you came back as a teacher. Were there things you were finding out, concerns that you were having to engage with, which just seemed unexpected? I mean, which sort of made the school, sort of gave you a different feeling of what the school was about. We've spoken about, of course, things like relationship and nature and so on, but anything else? And I suppose I can add to that question, that discovery, how did it happen? Was it difficult? Was it organic? Or maybe just to set the ball rolling, I'll give an example from my own experience. I remember that one of the things that struck me when I was in class 12 was at one point the teachers in the school were having a series of in-depth conversations on various aspects of what the school was about in small groups. And they invited students to be part of these conversations if they wanted to, and to, in fact, actually participate in them. And what struck me even then was, I was callow. I hadn't thought about issues at all. But whenever I had something to say or said something, uh, I found that people were listening and were interested. And it comes back to this whole thing of the respect one feels as a student in this school. One doesn't feel like a sort of second-class citizen, to put it a bit crudely. Um, but what left an impression on me in this experience is that adults were actually engaging together to try and understand something together, if possible. And for me, otherwise, I always thought of adults as knowing everything. The teachers in the school they knew what the school was, and not just that they know their subjects, but it had never occurred to me that there would be a lot of things that they would need to engage with each other in conversations on. And then when I came back as a teacher, it's only then I realized just how much time is spent by teachers in conversations at various levels, from very functional things about teaching subjects, teaching geography, for example, or whatever, to looking at very fundamental questions to do with the philosophy of the school and the way that's translated into classroom practice and so on. So I realized that that kind of inquiry was very, very central to the life of teachers. And I think that had never occurred to me when I was a student. I think I kind of took my teachers' knowledge and experience somewhat for granted. I never saw them as being fundamentally learners in the way I understood a learner to be. So that was something new I discovered. And then later, of course, I realized that this was very central to Krishnamurti's vision for the school, which is that it's as much a place of adult learning as it is, for children to learn. So that was for me really a discovery. And in some sense, it's a continuing discovery. So I was wondering if there was anything of that kind or anything else that any of you would like to speak about in terms of discovering what the school is really. I guess to sum up, I was saying, I think for me, I sort of discovered that the school was a place of inquiry. That was a new thing for me. Sorry, Kaavya, go ahead.
No. So I was this thing about you saying you discovering. Um, So for me, it was my whole idea of education. So despite being in a Krishnamurti school for the first 12 years, I obviously had this idea of what education is and what, I mean, what it should be. You go through the hoops, it's kind of linear, and you build on what you already know. But that really, I really sort of looked at it again very carefully about a few years ago, when my daughter decided that she did not want to go to first standard. And I was wondering, how can, like, why would she want to do that, and how is it okay? So a lot of the people around said it's fine, just let her not go. And I was questioning a lot of my own preconceived ideas of, I was sort of coming from the place that, oh no, she must go, she cannot not go. Um, so yeah, so that really sort of made me think about a lot of things. And then, reading a lot of things that people like, say, Ken Robinson or Peter Gray talk about education, uh, brought me to how even Krishnamurti talks a lot about this very similar idea of education is not just linear academic progression, but it's building the whole human person, and this idea of human flourishing. So how do we really allow a child to flourish in the way that they would want to do it? Respect them in not trying to mold them into something that you want them to be. So yeah, that
Very
was.
interesting. Yeah, thanks, Kavya. Yeah, Prashanth, Indus.
Yeah, Sid, I could really relate to what you were saying, right? Because as a student, uh, many of these things, these conversations with teachers or in the study center, as far as my memory can tell, were voluntary, right? And it's not something I ever attended myself, right? And I think it speaks directly to how we opened our conversation, right? Or um, at the beginning, when I was saying the things about relationship and nature being subconscious experiences, and Kavya highlighted that they're also intentionally done. I think there's a parallel here, right? So when I joined as a teacher, I realized through these weekly study meets, through the monthly study center sessions at the study center, through conversations outside of these formal spaces that teachers have amongst themselves, right? Whether it's in slightly more formal spaces like staff meetings or indeed during a break, right? Lunch and Ragi break and so on. So I too was struck by just how much thought goes into what feels natural and organic, right? So I'm not saying, not implying that it's contrived, not at all, but because it flows, at least your experience as a student is such that it flows from these teachers, and your experience is kind of seamless in that sense. Clearly, a lot of thought goes into it. But to respond more directly to the question of discovering the school, uh, I mean, for me, the first question that comes is, what is it that I'm calling the school? Right. And I find that it's a very interesting question to ask, because conventionally, and I include myself there as well, I've always understood it perhaps as the administration of the school, the key decision makers of the school. But having joined as a teacher in Valley, I quickly found it to be a quite democratic space, right? Where I was being encouraged to uh, think through things with others, to anchor different sessions, and and I felt comfortable enough to also, in our various contexts, question decisions that have been made or question practices that that previously existed, and so on. And so then it kind of this line between being a teacher and the identity of the school kind of blurs, because if I am saying that the school is the administration who make decisions, who kind of steer the school, so to speak, here I am kind of contributing to it, if I can say that. So So that continues to be a very interesting experience for me. So to ask that question, and and it's something that I have to continue reminding myself, because for so long you've understood the school to be an external entity and you an employee there, let's say, right? Even though everything points to, even if not the contrary, it certainly makes you question it, right? I mean, the sheer joy with which, the warmth with which people engage with you, the time people give you, right? The amount of encouragement that you have in, you constant regularly get in, to think of new ways of working, to critique things, and so on. Um, I think even the nature of these study meets and the study center sessions, if I could talk about them, uh, it it seems to so deeply align with, or so, yeah, so um, let me say it aligns very well with the intent of the school, and that's very encouraging too, because again, it's not something you're thinking of every passing minute, either as a student or as a teacher. But in these moments when you're looking back at or reviewing a discussion that you had in the study center, or I come back home and I'm chatting with my wife about it, and in sharing those experiences, somewhere you realize that, hey, it's quite gratifying and to know that we seem to be thinking about these important things, so I would say those are largely things that surprise me, as well as things that quietly kind of reassure me.
That's nicely put. Yeah. Thanks, Prashanth. How about you in this?
I could resonate with a lot of what you all shared. And I think for me, it sort of really comes back to this idea of questions. And that is something that, when our daughter joined school a couple of years ago, at an orientation for class one parents, we were asked, allow your children to question everything, even what you hold most dear. And we were both really moved by this. And we came home and told our parents, and they both remembered being told the same thing 30 years ago when we joined school. So it seems to be an enduring value of the place that, allow children, the spirit of inquiry, like allow it, And how I have really, experienced that in some sense in my classroom. I think that they really are free to ask questions and keep us also authentic. So, for example, I was trying to get my students to unwittingly to accept status quo in some way. I was saying that we've something to do with school policy. I said that we've come halfway now. Now we'll just leave it at this. And I remember they said, "But why? But why?" And I said, "Oh, it's okay. This is just what it is." And then I remember one of them asked, "But Indus, don't you ask questions?" And I really appreciate
Yeah.
that freedom to ask me that. And then I really went back and asked more questions. So
Mm.
I think it really is something that is an enduring value. And in terms of really epiphanies that I've had, little epiphanies that I've had. So at some level, I knew that what I found most compelling in many ways about Krishnamurti's philosophy is this idea that you are the world. You are not a Russian or an American. You are not Hindu or Muslim. You are apart from these labels. You're the rest of mankind. And I think I've been very moved by that. And for the summer before I joined school to teach, I had these two stories playing out right next to me. I had one friend whose boyfriend's parents were refusing to meet her because she was Christian and he was Hindu. And on the other hand, I had another friend who had a motorbike accident in the middle of the night. And a couple stopped and they saved his life. They actually sandwiched him between them, took him to the hospital, called his mother. And by the time we reached the hospital to help him, they had just left, and they had left the boy had left his visiting card, and it said Asif Ali Ahmad. It was a distinctly Muslim last name, and it turned out that they were returning from a wedding party of their own. He had married a Sikh girl, where their parents had refused to come again because it was an interreligious marriage, and I remember being sort of struck with this by this idea that for all the power you think you have over your children, you really can't know who will save their life in the middle of the night. You can think you can tell them whom to love or whom to marry, but you don't have no control over this. And I remember school felt like a place where, yes, really you were apart from these labels. And I felt, that coming back, yes, to teach here. And as a granddaughter of refugees of partition, actually, interestingly, my grandfather, my father, it would have been natural for them perhaps to hate the other, because many people ended up doing that. But instead, for them, with maybe self-reflection, they realized that the enemy is not the other, but it's hatred of the other that is the enemy. So these things, I think I felt, yes, this is what it is, and I don't want the labels, and we're the rest of mankind. But actually, the last 12 years at school has made me look a lot deeper into my own heart. Apart from nationalism, religion, I had to really consider my own biases in my own heart. And I'll tell you, I'll tell it as quickly as I can. I actually went to college because I encountered this poem of Sylvia Plath's in high school at Valley, Tulips. And I wrote about that in my college application. And because they knew that I had come because I loved Plath's work, I got a Plath scholar for my advisor. I ended up working in the archives with the curator who actually edited her journals. And I ended up, working at the Poetry Center, which was inspired by her meeting with Auden when he came. All this to say that I really loved Plath and I felt very close to her work. And then I came back to Valley to teach. And at some point, I had to teach Ted Hughes. And they say that inevitably, Platt scholars find an inevitable hardening of the heart toward Hughes. But when you have to teach Ted Hughes to 11 lit students, and among them 3 bright eyed 17-year-old boys, you have to drop all that bias that you carry in your heart. And so I had to spend some sleepless nights and really do some revision before I could enter my classroom. And I was so glad that I did, because one of the boys at the end of the class said to me, he said, Indus, all this while I always thought that Hughes was the villain of the piece. But now I see that they were both just human beings doing the best that they could. And actually, in Plath's words, making beauty out of sorrow. And I remember thinking that, yeah, this is what it is. We have to, in a way, drop all these ideas, these labels, these heroes, these villains, and have a growing sense of common humanity, see as the other might see more perspectives. And in a way, even now, these virulent trends like toxic masculinity and so on, I think no feminism, I mean, it's limited to approach it with that lens. But if you can approach children with respect and affection and encourage a spirit of inquiry in them and in yourself, then maybe, we'll be doing some of this work that we need to do. So, yeah, those have been my little epiphanies over the years.
Yeah. No, thanks, Indus. I mean, that was such a resonant example of discovery at work, discovering one's own prejudices, the hold of one's own prejudices, or even one's own learning, and the need to be able to let go of it where necessary. And then helping children to discover something for themselves, like the boy who was able to bring it to a question of humanity. Now, I'm again sort of keeping an eye on the time, and we could go on for hours, but I'd like to, since you brought up this issue of questioning, and I'm looking at one of the questions in the Q&A, and the question is about questions. And this is the question: the system's logic is to finish the syllabus. The learning logic is to understand what is being taught. Questions threaten the first, but they nourish the second. In other words, questions threaten this whole business of finishing the syllabus, because obviously they take time and so on, and you can get sidetracked. But they nourish the second, which is about learning. And the question the questioner has asked is, how should a teacher balance these? So I was wondering if any of you would like to respond to this. I suppose this whole business of learning as exploration, as discovery, versus learning in order to complete syllabus. Who is brave enough to take on that question?
I think Kaavya or Indus should be brave enough because I'm saying this half jokingly, but they perhaps have encountered this more regularly and for longer than I have, having taught in senior school for several years. Yeah.
So Prashanth is slamming out of it, so I'll have to leave it to both of you.
I think honestly, it seems to me that the two, though they seem like they pull in different directions, they actually go hand in hand, because when we engage with the real questions, the learning is so it is so striking. It's so that it actually helps with assessments. However, limited those assessments might be, I think children will actually flourish on those too once they've been able to ask all the questions that they had in their hearts and minds. I just have never experienced it to pull in different directions. That's why I didn't raise my hand to answer initially, because honestly, I have not really experienced it as conflict, only as deepening. So, yeah, that's.
Yeah, I have to say that that's been my experience too. Kavya, is there anything you'd like to say about this?
No, I'm just thinking about it.
Okay, all right. Let me come to another question, which again has to do with the classrooms, and it's in some ways a similar question, and maybe it's been implicitly addressed, but in case any of you would like to add, in many classrooms, teachers quietly carry two responsibilities that often pull them in different directions, to help students learn and to help them perform. Can you share your experience as a teacher in the Valley School? So again, it's a very similar question to the last one, but I've asked it anyway because here it may not just be about syllabus. So for example, let's take, cultural activities play an important role in our school, right? And there is often this issue of performance and learning. So how does one find the sweet spot here? How does one find the right balance here and ensure that performance doesn't dictate? And yet, of course, performance becomes a great motivator to help people to put in their best and so on. So that's the way I'm interpreting this question. So it need not only be about academics.
I remember writing something on this a couple of years ago in the journal after a conversation with a friend. Um, and I experienced it for myself a couple of years, maybe 3 years ago, when I was working with the class six students towards a play that they had to perform on middle school cultural day. And it it was a very I felt that particular year I felt more invested in the performance than in any other year, if I'm to be honest, because I'd written the script for the play, and so I felt this sense of ownership, and if I'm to be completely honest, also this pressure that comes along with the comes along anytime when the performance is at the helm, right? And so it was something very, very interesting that I experienced. And I would say that it was a struggle, right? There's no two ways of putting it, right? There's a certain amount of time you have. You want children to learn their lines well enough. Uh, I, I, I can't say it's something that I don't think I can say that learning was the priority at the time, if I'm to be completely honest. It was about making progress. It's about getting the rehearsals right, improving on certain things, working separately with certain students. And it was almost, it very quickly became the single-minded focus, right? And in hindsight, I feel like there could have been other ways of going about it. Uh, but I suppose one lives to learn, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
That's, I think, part of one's discovery. You always find that, you're learning on the job, which is in
Mhm.
some ways the best way of learning. Uh, by the way, there's a pithy response in the Q&A to this whole business
Sorry,
of
Sid. Sorry to cut you off. Just to complete that
yes,
thought.
yes, I'm sorry. I thought you,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
no, no, no. I had finished, but I just thought I'd add to
yeah,
it. I just thought it stood in stark contrast to a few years before. I think it was my first or second year, where the cultural program was again going to happen, but only this time, I hadn't written the play and I didn't feel like I had to lead the effort. And I remember I was invited to just make a few remarks to the audience after the performances, and at the time I'd said, while of course the children had worked well together and have put up this performance after much effort, the most enjoyable times for me was outside of the performance, right? Behind closed doors in that sense, and where there would be laughter and there would be people pulling each other's leg, and how we kind of papered over some of the cracks, and and just came to me, and I think it lies in stark contrast to my experience a few years later. Um, and so I think they both have something to say to each other, because very quickly one can say, perhaps the latter, the second story I shared is what what more future experiences should be like. But I don't quite think it's that simple. I think they can both speak to each other and should speak to each other.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I was just saying there was a pithy response to this whole business of working towards syllabus and working towards exploration. And so it's been typed to explore fully, the syllabus gets done. And which is a sort of summary, I think, of what Indus was saying. And interestingly, it comes from another old student of a Krishnamurti school who's gone back to teach, and that's Karthik Kalyanram. So, but now I have another question. One of the things that we find ourselves having to do as teachers, whether or not we like doing it, is giving certain kinds of instructions to children about things they're doing or things they should not be doing, whether it's in the classroom, may have to do with aspects of behavior or other kinds of habits. And here's a question relating to that. And the question is, how do you differentiate between giving directions a bit authoritatively, right? Which might look like controlling them about in what they do in life. And the examples given are about having less screen time at home or better hygiene or good eating habits. Now, you may feel that all of these are really important things and that the children are not really not going to take them seriously unless you, in some sense, uh, bring a certain authority to it. I was wondering if you have any response to that. Kaavya, would you like to respond to that? To this question of authority and the teacher's authority? And about how effective a teacher could be without that sort of authoritativeness, if there is such a word.
I think I think in our schools, particularly, the children are really attuned to and also maybe expect their teachers to be treat them with respect, and they can very quickly sense when you're not doing that. So they would,
Right.
I mean, even if you try to be controlling, um, they know when you're being genuine and when you're just being a ill-mannered adult, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. So our children know us too well. Is that the issue? But sometimes, you might not be being ill-mannered, but there's a situation in which, for whatever reason, there's an urgent need for a certain kind of action, either to take place or to stop happening. And you might not inwardly be anger, but out of a certain clarity, and because you recognize that they won't take it seriously unless you speak in a certain way, you do that. Now, is that all right? Or does that go against the grain in a school which is founded on, ideas of learning together, mutual respect, a certain kind of democratic way of functioning, to use a word which has already come up in this conversation? Is it okay, in other words, to impose your authority in any situation?
No.
Okay. Any other responses to that?
I um I feel like the first step has to be to acknowledge the presence and the reality of that authority, right? That I think I'm with Kavya when she says that the students do expect to be treated with kindness, with a degree of respect, right? To use a slightly more nuanced word. Uh, but I think,
But sorry, just to interrupt here, Prashant, does speaking with authority, let us say, necessarily imply a lack of respect or care or even love?
yeah, no, so I was just going to come to that, and I hope to be able to respond to that question through what I'm going to share. I think we've all likely to have been in those situations where we've had to speak with authority, right? And I think it's a constant balance that one needs to strike. But in that moment, it is something that can prove to be a bit of a challenge. Uh, I would say what determines how the conversation pans out depends a lot on what the teacher is expecting, right? So what I mean is, if I if sometimes you are so let's say disturbed by a certain situation, and so your instinct almost wants you to quote unquote fix it, right? And so one begins to think in a relatively short term fashion, right? That, hey, this needs to be fixed, and therefore I need to speak with a certain authority and stop this at once, right? But I think even in addressing those slightly, let's say, disturbing situations, where I have found students responsive is when there's logic in whatever you're sharing with them, right? There may not be warmth in that moment, right? There might be respect, sure, but there may not be warmth. And I can if I'm to be completely honest, in those situations, it can prove challenging to be warm, right? Um, so the point I was trying to make is that when you explain to children why it is that what they've done is not okay, as opposed to getting upset yourself, I think they're able to kind of distinctly see that here is a person who's speaking to me, but it's not that they're personally hurt by it, but they are along with, they may not feel like you're on their side in that moment. So it's tricky, but it's important for them to see you as an entity outside of the incident, right? That you're not
But it's
responding emotionally from that incident.
yeah, but again, when you said it's tricky, you're not on their side at that moment, so it's
Mm.
tricky. But I mean, there's no reason for one to be on a side at all. I mean, you're interested in the right thing happening.
Yeah,
And if children are, let's take an example of some kind of harassment, which can easily happen among children. Children aren't always angelic towards each other
yeah,
and can sometimes be pretty nasty to each other. And as an adult, one has to step in and maybe step in quite forcefully. But I think you hit the nail on the head when they realize you're stepping in not out of personal hurt, or even if you are personally anguished, that's not what's driving you,
yeah.
rather than a concern with the right thing happening. Uh, yeah, because otherwise, when one doesn't speak with a certain, let us say, clarity and at times a certain firmness, that can also send the wrong signals where it's something which needs that sort of action. Yeah, sorry, any others? I mean, Indus, is there anything you wanted to add to this?
The word that was coming to my mind is care. I think when they can see that we're coming from a place of care, I think it makes all the difference. And of course, we have to hold boundaries as teachers, as parents. But I think that if we can do it with as much both firmness and gentleness as we can, it's most effectively held. Forget everything else. It's just most effective if we can
Right,
do it both firmly and gently, and they can see that we're coming from a place of care. That's been
right.
my experience, honestly.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Now, I'd like to come to a different question. and this is from someone who's been very intimately connected with our work. Do you feel that you as a teacher are able to ensure that each child in your class feels secure, at ease with himself, herself, with a sense of self-worth, not bogged down by comparison or a pressure to be accepted by peers or to perform in the way Prashanth had referred? Could you mention an instance or two where you could help a student to meet this reality with equanimity? So I guess the reality being referred to at the end of the question is this one of being bogged down by comparison, pressure to be accepted, and allowing, and there are always children seem to be at the receiving end of that. And how do we ensure as teachers that every single child finds a safe space in the school? Has this been a challenge?
I think where I've I may not be able to pick out specific scenarios, but from my experience over the last few years, I feel like conversations around these things, where a child has been hurt not by a specific incident, but perhaps how they have been treated by their peers, or the pressures they may be feeling academically in school or at home, are best had, I found, one-on-one. Right?
Mm.
I think these things need to, of course, happen in conversations in culture class and CD class, but I think in this particular case, the way this question has been phrased, I think it calls for a one-on-one dialogue where the child feels like you are giving them your time, and perhaps implicitly, like Indus used the word care, that there is care in that. If you are taking away, taking out time and specifically for this child, I think that's the implicit message. More directly speaking, I think I found that sharing, I think you spoke about how as a student we looked upon adults as people who knew it all, who had figured it out. I felt absolutely the same way, and it could be it could be that some of these students feel that way about adults. And so I think, to move past that, I generally find that sharing something in your own life, in your own experience as a student, right, which at least loosely correlates with what they are going through, I think greatly helps, because suddenly they don't see you necessarily as just a teacher, just a class teacher, or a social studies teacher. They're able to see that you're human and that you've gone through some difficult things that humans seem to go through. And it's a fine balance. Again, it's a fine balancing act, because you don't want to make it about you, right? But you do want to give them just enough so that they perhaps somewhere feel like this can happen to others, because sometimes in those moments you can feel quite lonely, as if it's something that's happening only to you. And somewhere if they're able to see that here's an adult, um, who's gone through some of these experiences and has managed to go go through into adulthood in some ways, and is able to and is able to share these things with me, I feel like it's not the solution, but I think it could be the start of something
Right.
meaningful.
Sure. Kavya, in this, anything on this? Because this is something we face at all levels in the school. Yeah, Kavya, go ahead.
I feel like you know, especially this age, I personally feel this age of like 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, they are they're really going into this sort of shell of their own, and they still want intensely to belong to their peer group, um and you know, meet the expectations of maybe their parents or society. And we can't really do so much. It's a lot of their own journey, but if they know that we are around and we mean well, I think that really gives them some kind of confidence that they could approach us if they have some issue that they have. But it's just that you hope they wouldn't get sucked into this wanting to belong with their peers or wanting to excel academically because of some social pressures or wanting to earn so much money.
Yeah.
You would hope that they figure it out by themselves and you're there to help them through it. But I don't know how much we can really do in
Yeah.
those times.
In fact, I think one thing which is worth keeping in mind, I think, is that as teachers, we are not gods. Not everything is in our hands. There are a lot of things, despite, all the time we spend looking at issues, discussing them, the help we get from our peers, our own experiences, and our love for the children. Uh, Sometimes there's not much more one can do than just being available as much as possible, being a listening presence, uh, because some problems are complex and and we need to recognize that we don't always have solutions to them. And yet, just being there, is so important. Yeah, Indus, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, I think in many ways, this question is actually the whole journey. This
Yeah,
question is why we do what we do, and it's what we
yeah,
carry in our hearts. And I think that, they really do have, and we all have this need to belong and to belong authentically, to belong exactly as we are, right? And that's the tricky thing that otherwise we have to change parts of ourselves and fit in. And we really, what we want is to belong. And I
yeah,
feel that in a way, as teachers, while you're absolutely right, we are not gods and we don't have control over all the outcomes. At the same time, it does feel like a special responsibility in a classroom because you can imagine this whole world into being in some ways and how we interact with each other. So I suppose the effort is to definitely journey alongside each one of them and be this listening presence, like you said, in their lives, that they know they can come to us for anything, right? Um,
right,
and also at the same time to encourage them, like you were saying with the earlier question, to be good to each other, to be good to themselves, right? This idea of goodness to me, like the flower in that goodness is so I think it's this question is the whole journey, like we're reconciling all those things. Yeah.
right. Yeah, absolutely. Uh, well, we are running out of time, but let me take up a different kind of question. Or I'm not sure if it's different. And the question is this: what advice would you give to a current student to make the most of their time at school, considering your experience on both sides, as student and teacher? So, what would you tell students? And how to make the most of their time at school? Are we all stumped?
I think most of them are making the most of their time at school.
They don't need us to tell them how to
Yeah.
do it. Okay. All right. Yeah.
I would echo Kavya's thoughts, but I would perhaps add a little more, which is
Yeah.
that I think uh, for the most part they are trying to do that, and they and the students in these schools that certainly that I've experienced as a student and as a teacher, uh, that seems to come so naturally, to try and really. And it's sorry, I shouldn't use the word try at all. It's just something that flows, right? They do what they do because they love it, and when they love it, they do more of it, right? And but I don't know if this qualifies as advice, but uh, I would certainly say, in addition to making the most of your experiences, to also see the relevance of your own actions and words on those around you. Um, And especially in the age group that Kavya was talking about earlier, right, where peer approval is is held above all in many ways, and in so and so to respond with or to act and speak with those things in mind, that this is not just my experience and therefore my experience to be made the most of, but rather that my words and actions have a say and have a perhaps more significant say than I might imagine. Because we spoke about how students can sometimes not be very kind to each other, but I don't think they quite understand the degree to which they are hurting another, right? Otherwise, I feel like they wouldn't do it at all, right? It's somewhere that not knowing. So, if to answer that question directly, I would say perhaps to help the child see that their actions and words have more of a say than they might imagine.
Underlying what you just said, Prashanth, I think is something which seems to be implicit in the schools, though we don't probably talk about it that way, which is a kind of faith in basic human goodness. So when you say that people, when they are unpleasant to each other, it's more ignorance than intention. I mean, of course, it's something worth debating, but I'd like to believe you're right. Indus, anything on this question?
Yeah, actually, I think that it's. I was thinking what I really tell my students, and it's very much the same thing. Just to come back to where I began, that it's a place where
Mm.
I can be most myself, right? I actually had a friend come back the other day, a classmate, who said I came back because I wanted to spend a morning feeling like myself. So I was telling my students the same thing, that if you can somehow here, if you can find it in your hearts to be your authentic selves and let each other be your authentic selves and all belong here just as you are, then not just for today, but forever, this will be a world where you would have authentically belonged. So I feel Prashant is saying very much the same thing too, and I really resonate with that. I think that if somehow here we can work together, we can talk to each other, engage, and have this be a world where we can authentically belong, each of us, just as we are, then it will always be that for us. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, that's a lovely point at which maybe we should think of stopping, though there are some more questions that have come in, but we are running out of time, so maybe we can see if there's some other way by which we can take up these questions on another occasion. For example, there's a question from about parents. How can we as parents help our children discover their interests and not merely run after money or fame or comparing with peers? I mean, that's a very deep question that, in one way or the other we encounter. And I think one thing which we haven't spoken about in the course of this webinar is, in fact, the role of parents in the school. And parents, obviously, it's very crucial that, parents, teachers, uh, are aligned or at least interested in exploring what this whole business of education and the school is. Otherwise, you have a situation where parents and teachers might be giving children very different kinds of signals. So we don't really have time to take up that question, nor questions which have come up about use of AI and smartphones. But again, I hope that these may come up in future webinars. And I see just now another question and this is a question which we face a lot, which is that children in our schools seem to be somewhat insulated from the divisiveness happening in the outside world. And how well will they be prepared to face those realities once they leave? Again, a rich question, and a question that, we are often, faced with and finding different ways of addressing. In fact, another question is about how, um, I'm just reading the question, does the school organize outreach events, days for people interested to learn more about these our models of education and practices? And I'll just very quickly respond that, people who are interested do reach out to the schools individually. And or sometimes as groups from schools that want to visit us, or just, and they organize visits. These webinars are also designed to serve as a kind of introduction to not just to what we are doing in the schools, but to the kinds of challenges we face, the kinds of questions that we are carrying. So do get in touch with us, do attend these webinars, write to the schools, and hopefully we can have a lot more meaningful interactions. So for those whose questions we didn't have time to go into, I apologize, but we do need to wind up now. I would just thank all of you for being here. A recording of this webinar will be available on the KFI's webinar YouTube channel in a few days. So you can always replay it or share it with others whom you think might be interested. And thank you very much, Kaavya, Indus, Prashanth. It was such a joy meeting together like this. Of course, we meet all the time in school, but this was a new experience, and it was a lot of fun and very rich. So thank you.
Thank
So, yeah.
Thanks, Sid.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Okay.
Kaavya. Bye. See you.
So goodbye.